Hello, Internet. My name is Camille.
And I'm Requiem.
And after spending like most of the last episode trying and failing to retrieve that guilt fragment from the toxic gas, I decided that off camera I was going to go and grab the lung that makes you immune to toxic gas real quick. So yeah, and then because of various other fetch quests, I wound up over here. You haven't really missed anything important. I've just been running around places we've already been to. So, we were talking about the Satanic Panic.
Yeah, so pretty much everybody was, as I noted, was involved in it in some form or the other. Like, there are individual actors who are not on board with this, but for the most part, the culture as a whole is on board with the idea that this is a thing. It is happening. It reverberates throughout our culture. Like I mentioned, Dungeons and Dragons moving away from explicit Christian references like demons and devils. You also get there's a lot of backlash against media in general. Like there's a turmoil in the Toy Box book that basically names every major cartoon at the time as being sort of satanically influenced. Basically, anything that has any sort of supernatural element, regardless of whether it's actually connected to the devil or not, gets tarred with this brush. There's a thing I've noticed in conservative Protestant Christianity where, like, the best defense against something is to be as ignorant about it as possible. Like, you see this with opposition to sex education, where it's like, all right, the best way to keep our kids from having sex is to just keep them as ignorant as possible. And it's kind of the same thing with Satanism, with the occult. Like, if you believe that supernatural forces existed in the world, you want kids to know about them, like, be informed about them. And, like, if you have a TV show where, like, there's supernatural influences that are defeated by the forces of Christianity, you think that'd be good. But even stuff like that, like, there are people who don't like Touched by an Angel or the Chronicles of Narnia because it has a supernatural element, even though, like, Chronicles of Narnia is very overtly Christian. Touched by an Angel, what?
Extremely so. Like,
yeah,
it gets a little heavy-handed with it in a couple of the later books.
Touched by an Angel is admittedly a little more secular than that, but it's still pretty. Nothing in that is really that objectionable. But there's this idea, this bizarre idea, and it goes even back in the witch trials. Like, anything you did to protect yourself from witches is witchcraft. Like, one of the early incidents in the Salem witch trials is somebody bakes a witch cake, which to see if there's a witch about, but that's a form of witchcraft, and that sort of, like, gets her in trouble. So there's this idea in Protestant Christianity that in conservative Protestant Christianity, that the best defense is ignorance. It's like the Imperium of man.
An open mind is like a fortress with its gates unbarred.
Like, we laugh, but, like,
there's more to that quote, but yeah.
That's basically what it is, and you see it, that's basically what it is with sex education, where it's like, we don't want our kids to have sex, so we just don't tell them anything about sex, and they end up, it actually ends up being really bad. Places without sex education, the kids have more sex, and they have it unprotected, but...
Which, I mean, you know, seems like the obvious result. Like, it's weird that people didn't see this coming.
But what, so we eventually, and, like, there are, very early on, there are people looking at this and going, does not make sense, the evidence isn't there. The Politics of Child Sex Abuse is published in 1986. It doesn't make a huge impact. The Satanic Panic continues unabated. We don't really start to see the backlash until the early 90s. That's when you see some of these stories being debunked. Somebody finally investigates Mike Warnke's whole thing in 92, and they discover that, like, nothing that he had said was true. He was active Christian when he was claiming to have been a satanic high priest. There's no record of him ever being a satanic high priest. Because what some of these confessing Satanists do is, like, you can look at, like, they can sound relatively accurate, because, like, if I want to know what the actual Church of Satan believes, like, I can go buy the Satanic Bible at Barnes & Noble, like, and, like, it's true that there have been prominent people in the Church of Satan, like, not a ton, but, like, you know, like, Marilyn Manson, and there was that one, like, I don't, there was that one singer in, like, the 70s whose name I am forgetting, but, like,
here's what we're after.
Somebody investigates Mike Warnke, and they're like, they discover that, like, everything he said was a lie. In 1990, the Mail on Sunday investigates Michelle Remembers, and they debunks it. I assume they start with, they literally summoned Satan. Obviously, this isn't real. Like, so you start, and it continues even as this is happening.
Is
but
Michelle
you are starting...
Remembers true? Well, they literally summoned Satan, so no. The rest of this book is academic.
And the cases continue as this is happening, but it starts to finally, as more and more of these debunkings come out, and also some of the conservative Christianity shifts to other things, like we start seeing video games becoming a bigger issue. Mortal Kombat is released in 1982. Primary focus of Mortal Kombat is violence. Goosebumps comes out in the same year. Focus on that is just it's inappropriate for children just because it's scary.
Funny enough, Goosebumps isn't that scary. Like, Goosebumps is exactly the kind of horror that you want, like, a second grader reading. Where
it's scary if you're 8, I guess.
I never found... I mean, in fairness, I did not read Goosebumps until I was, like, 10 or 11. I never found it frightening.
95, Satan's Silence is published, and Frontline does a whole episode debunking all of these, a lot of these cases. After that, you still see Satanic Panic stuff get published, but increasingly the cases are going away. As I mentioned, last case I found is like 95. There might be cases after that, but for the most part, it is petered off. Eventually, a lot of the people, not all of them, but a lot of the people who got accused will be released from prison, like the West Memphis 3. They'll have their sentences commuted, or they'll be outright pardoned. Increasingly, the conservative Christians have to turn to, they have to start talking about stuff that you can no longer talk about occultism as being an issue, because, like I said, occultism is only an issue if you are a Christian, because it's essentially being a different religion. So you can no longer go after stuff for being
even saying if you are a Christian is overstating it. It's only an issue if you are a theocrat. Yeah.
Like, the conservative Christianity does continue, and it does have issues that it's able to grab the mainstream media's attention, but it increasingly has to turn to, like, issues that a non-Christian might worry about, like sex in media. So, like, the Janet Jackson scandal at the Super Bowl, like, they're able to make a big deal about that, but that's not a purely Christian thing. Now, note that it wasn't Janet Jackson's fault. Like, there's just recently been a lot of discussion about that, and I will emphasize it wasn't. Janet Jackson did not actually done anything wrong, and she was unfortunately caught in the crossfires of this. Like, people made jokes about the wardrobe malfunction.
Like, that is that part of Americana is in my historical blind spot, where it happened when I was young enough that I had no idea what was really going on, but because it happened during my lifetime, it never felt like history, and I never bothered really looking into it at all.
Right. So in 2004, I want to say, during the Super Bowl performance, Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake were singing a song, and he grabs her corset and accidentally, like, I think it was supposed to rip off, but it was not supposed to rip off as much as it did, and her breast was briefly exposed, and that basically ended her career. There were jokes about it being a wardrobe malfunction, but, like, it seems like it was legitimately just a wardrobe malfunction. And also the number of complaints was much smaller than got reported. It was like one parenting advocacy group that did a lot of the complaints. Most people didn't care.
I'm sure there are children that are watching the Super Bowl. But really, how many? Like, I'm
So
not saying that we
increasingly-
should, start a tradition of having, like, outright porn shows as our Super Bowl halftime shows. I'm just saying. I don't think a quick nip slip was
Yeah.
that big of a deal. Like,
But
I'm pretty
increasingly it
sure
has to
that
be-
the primary demo for that is, men aged, like, 15 to 45.
Yeah. But the point being, increasingly they have to talk about issues that a non-conservative Christian might care about, so they increasingly drop the occultism angle and just talk about sex and violence. So, like, the backlash during gangster rap, like, that was not... No one was saying that gangster rap was satanic. The focus was on the idea that it was promoting violence. Or violence in video games, sex in video games. They mostly don't talk about... They don't really talk about video games being a cult. They have dropped that angle and talked about just sex and violence. The last sort of attempt at sort of a satanic panic thing is late 90s is against Harry Potter, and they basically completely fail. Like, Harry Potter is now one of the biggest media properties in the world. Like, they're able to get the media to discuss the possibility of problems with Harry Potter, but ultimately, like, they're not able to do anything to Harry Potter. It continues on, and we're at the point where, like, they've just accepted it. They no longer fight it. Like, and you also see a little later than that the Da Vinci Code, which this is interesting just because the Da Vinci Code, I would say, actually is overtly anti-Christian. Like, people sometimes try to argue that, like, oh, it's just a different kind of Christianity. I was like, well, it's like, it's vaguely based on a Christian heresy from the, like, 4th century that got defeated, and no modern form of Christianity is connected to, and also it's denying, like, one of the few things that basically every form of modern Christianity agrees upon, the death of Jesus on the cross.
Yeah.
Which is fine. Like, I'm not upset about it being anti-Christian. It's just, like, it is anti-Christian.
There's a much more weirdly, like, it's hard to even say for sure if it's anti-Christian, honestly, but in one of the other books that has the same character, I forget if it's a sequel or a prequel or what, there is, like, an atheist Illuminati.
Oh, I didn't read that one.
Which, yeah, it is, like, the atheist Illuminati are depicted fairly sympathetically in that, like, they are legitimately wronged by, like, one of them is a scientist who has this debilitating disease because his parents were devout and, like, kind of believe that, like, oh, he'll live if it's God's will, when he was, like, had this terrible disease when he was 8, and a doctor eventually gave him an actual medical injection and just kind of whispered to him that, like, I can't let this happen. And by that point, he was already, in a vaguely Stephen Hawking-esque way, crippled, but survived. So, like, that's super heavy-handed, but it is ultimately a sympathetic backstory for the primary atheist antagonist. And,
yeah.
The main antagonist, that guy's kind of like a side antagonist who is, I think, even ultimately more helpful to the good guys than not in the end. And the main antagonist is like a extremist Christian cult.
Yeah.
So.
But, like, and like that, they're able to get the media to engage with it. They don't really necessarily come super hard anti-Da Vinci Code. They're able to get the media to engage with it. But after that, it's like, that's it. The media no longer engages with stuff that's purely Christian, and increasingly, even on the sex and violence front, they lose. Like video games are more violent than ever. Sex is more prevalent in media than ever. I was watching this made-for-Netflix movie at one point that was like this high school comedy, and at one point, the main character, who was very young looking, goes down on a girl, and I felt uncomfortable just watching. And, like, there was a time something like that would have gotten the conservatives up in arms and would have been, like, talked about in the mainstream media, but like it's now a blip. And even with the occultism, like they've completely lost on that. Like on Adventure Time, Peppermint Butler is basically a demonologist. Like he does devil summoning rituals, like pretty explicitly. You've got Lucifer on a network TV where the devil is the good guy. Tieflings are core race in D&D, and as far back as 3rd edition, which I think was late 90s that it came out?
2000 to 2008. So.
2000. So starting in 2000, they go back to using the terms demon and devil and angel.
I've also just realized that the item I'm trying to get from here, you can only get after you've defeated the boss, which I don't want to do yet.
And like we're playing Blasphemous, which there was a time like something like this would have an enormous outrage.
Right.
Or even like the new Doom movie. Like Doom was controversial when it came out, both for the violence and for the imagery, the devil imagery. Now it's just nobody cares. Like you did see a little bit of criticism from the violence from the left, but from the right, like they don't have the cultural power that they did anymore. They cannot make it an issue anymore. So, and like
yeah,
part of it, like I don't really know. I cannot tell you necessarily what the right, the conservative Christians are upset about anymore because they no longer reach the mainstream. They don't. Like there used to be a time just existing in the culture, you would know what they were up in arms about because it would reach you, but now you would have to be like embedded in that culture to know, and I'm not, and so it just doesn't reach me. Like there might be stuff that they are actively upset about, but they no longer have the cultural pull for the most part that they once did. Though that does bring us to the kind of caveat in what I just said, which is Pizzagate.
Right. Definitely noticed some familiar trends when you were describing all this stuff from back in the 80s that I wasn't really there for, but I was there for Pizzagate.
And like I just like one of the things is like comparatively, so with the original Satanic Panic, the media was actively complicit in this. With Pizzagate, they did not give Pizzagate the time of day, except when it got big enough that they felt the need to try to debunk it. But with Pizzagate,
I feel like the need to try and debunk it might be giving them too much credit, but it was definitely more a look at these dummies kind of clickbait as opposed to they're coming for your kids kind of clickbait.
Yeah. And the thing is, like, I don't know, like, all this stuff I talked about, like, I don't know, like, it seems like we're at the, like, cultural, like, it's not that, like, cultural Christianity is lost. Is it like, is this a last gasp effort on it? Is it, with the crime wave? The crime wave's been over for decades. So it can't be related to the crime wave? Like, it's like, what is the cause? And I'm not super sure.
I'm
not
sure for that.
4chan, which is really interesting because, like, if there was any group that I would think would be inured to shock imagery, I would have thought it would be 4chan. Like, they got all up in arms about Marina Abramovich's spirit cooking thing, which is basically the sort of, it's intended to be shocking, but it's the sort of shocking that is like entry level on 4chan. So I don't know, like, why is it suddenly Marina Abramovich does it, and this thing that would get you laughed out of B as being a tryhard is suddenly, oh, this is proof of a real conspiracy. Like,
I have no idea how 4chan got to this place. That said, I do think, I mean, the defeat of Christianity as, like, a cultural force, you know, an anti-secular cultural force, has always been temporary, like, both inevitable and temporary in America. It's, again, you know, there have been multiple Great Awakenings. All of them have gotten annoying at some point, and all of them have subsequently been rejected, and, I mean, I don't want to say this too, because I have a theory that I have still not done the research for to, you know, double check if this cycle actually does happen. So, it's not a theory, it is a hypothesis, it is unproven. Bear that grain of salt in mind. One thing I am very confident of, though, is that there are fundamentally 3 poles to American spirituality. There is quote-unquote traditional Christianity, whose traditions are always rooted about 30 to 50 years in the past. There is pure secularism, which is not the same as atheism, right? It does not reject religion, but it basically says that that's between you and your God, which was, that was the pole that the American Revolution was founded on. If you want traditional Americanism, that is the closest you're going to get.
Almost all the founders were deists, not Christians.
Right.
Which, in 1770, deism is about as close to atheism as you can get.
Yeah, it's extremely secular. You will find references to God in, American founding documents, because it was just kind of taken as a given that, there had to have been some kind of creator. But it is actually very much against America's revolutionary and patriotic values to put a whole lot of stock on the details of God. Other than trusting that there is some kind of creator, there was never any strong emphasis, even back, way, way back. There was never any strong emphasis on exactly what kind of traits that creator might have. That all men were created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights was not backed up with Bible verse or whatever. It was not a religiously motivated declaration. It was just sort of the assumed origin of humanity at the time.
Fundamentalism is a very modern phenomenon. It's much younger than people realize, 1800s.
Right. But then you do also have various forms of spiritualism and occultism and other woo that become popular.
One of the sort of predecessors to the charismatic Pentecostals is the spiritualists, which is a form of that.
Right.
That's one of the criticisms that got lodged at the charismatic Pentecostals was that they were adopting this stuff from spiritualism.
And I mean, they were, but American occultism, however, is always very sort of happy and bright. Its most recent incarnation is crystal energy and good vibes and stuff like that. And while that's definitely a very different flavor from what the spiritualists had going for them, the fundamental pitch of the spiritualists initially was, hey, that guy who died in the Civil War? We all know one of those. Well, we can put you back in touch with him, and you can get some closure. It's, very spooky and ghosty, but it is fundamentally, about... I'm fishing around for another word. I can't find one. I'm just going to use the obvious one. It is about closure. It was... I ultimately feel like it was kind of abusive because none of that stuff works. But it was ultimately about helping people, was their pitch, at the very least. Okay, we're doing this now.
You needed to get that off first.
Yeah, I don't want to be trying to fight a boss and trying to make a cogent point at the same time. That's going to go very poorly for both things.
That is fair.
I do recall the Tres Angustias being a relatively easy boss, but...
I guess we'll find out.
Yeah, bear in mind, relatively easy means it only took me a couple of attempts, so
I don't know what the factors were that ultimately, outside of the individual actors debunking the incidences that led to sort of the cultural abandonment of it. Some of our conversations can have suggested that the Satanic Panic advocates were so thoroughly debunked, and the conservative Christians had spent their energy on nonsense that it got to the point where they had used up all their cultural cachet.
That's what I suspect. See, because referring back again to the three poles of American spiritualism of, quote-unquote traditional Christianity, which is not actually traditional, standard American secularism, and that, mystical woo spiritualist stuff. I have a hypothesis that there's a cycle between them, which, again, haven't done the research to double-check this, but it does fit with all the parts of history that I know offhand. So you have the secularist stuff, which, like the American Revolution, which was also, in the 50s, we were a fairly secular thing. You could see bits of Christianity, of Christian emphasis, but even that was largely tossed in as a reaction to the Soviet embrace of atheism. But, in the 40s and 50s, the heart of American moral value was not in the preacher. Like, the preacher was certainly seen as a moral person, but it was the politician and, surprisingly enough, even the lawyer. And an important part of that, possibly, about as important as the preacher was, there was the serious-minded scientist wearing a white lab coat and twisting the knob on some kind of power infrastructure.
In fact, it kind of reminds me of Camille Paglias' theory about the tolerance to decadence to backlash. And sort of like, you can feel like the conservative Christianity, where you go with the tolerance being the secularism, the decadence being the woo, and then the backlash being the conservative Christianity that wants to go back 30 years.
Right. Who want to harken back to the traditions that they claim the country was founded on, for which there is absolutely no historical evidence past about 30 to 50 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, that's true of conservatives a lot. Like, the idealized America, like, it used to be the 1950s, but now is, I think, the idealized conservative America is probably the 1980s.
Yeah. In fact, if you ask people when America, like, when was the best America, a lot of conservatives will say around the year 2000. Like, after Bush had been elected, but before 9/11.
That brief, like, that there is that weird, the 90s are this weird decadent time, especially since they, pre-9/11, post-fall of the Soviet Union, where American hegemony is unquestioned.
And funny enough, what is her name? Camille Paglias, something like that?
Yeah.
So, she phrases it as the decadence being, when eras when, the lefty type things are sort of just, everywhere, and you can be open and blatant about it, and it's just accepted to the point of not even being, drawing comment. But it's, the funny thing is that I think about it in almost reverse terms of the secular era as the era of the backlash, when people are sick of, Christian busybodies, basically, getting into everyone's business, and they're just like, no, spiritualism is, a big scam, it's an excuse for people, and obviously this is drawing a lot on the language of the most recent iteration of the cycle. You won't see people saying exactly this in most parts of American history, but there is this attitude of, like, everyone becomes almost had it. Everyone becomes Easter and Christmas Christians, and they kind of consider it becomes the opposite of prestigious, unprestigious, anti-prestigious, to be really religiously committed. You come across as zealous and unhinged, and, like, even again, like, prior to the very most recent couple of decades, like, the last 2 decades in particular, being openly atheist was never really a thing in America, but being extremely secular, of like, yeah, presumably there was some kind of God, but stop making noise about it, it's not important. That's been a common attitude.
Yeah. And like that's like a lot of like high Protestantism is very much like that. High Protestants being like your Episcopalians, your Methodists, Presbyterians.
High elves now. So the evangelicals then would be the dark Protestants.
If you go to like the high Protestant, there's more emphasis on the ritual, but they also tend to be more left-leaning, and they feel more secular. Like high Protestants will generally not necessarily be much more Easter and Christmassy.
Right. That's you know, you get into sort of a, you know, church as a community gathering if you're into that sort of thing.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, I'm sure you can tell that even though I do find the militant atheists a little bit tiresome, I am strongly in favor of the secularist mindset, to the point where, you know, the American spiritual occult woo is a lot less aggressive than American Christianity. But, like, you know, you can tell that I'm probably more dismissive of it than I should be thinking about it. Because ultimately it is just kind of, yeah, okay, whatever, you do you. But, it does just feel very head in the clouds to me.
Yeah, that was our Satanic Panic arc.
Yep.
Moral panics are bad. The media frequently is complicit in this stuff for ratings. I would say, like, there's a little bit of sometimes moral panic still about violence in the media. The actual evidence does not support the idea that violence in, like, video games or media causes violence in the real world. This is something that's been extensively studied and found pretty wanting. When they do studies on video games connection to aggression, first of all, they just talk about aggression in general, not necessarily violence. And second of all, the usual finding is that it is a game being frustrating, difficult, that causes increase in aggression, not the game being violent. An easy, violent game is not going to increase aggression. A difficult but peaceful game, like a super hard version of Tetris, will increase your aggression. But even then, there's no correlation with violence. Nothing happened in the media at the end of the 90s that changed, that made the crime wave stop. Like I mentioned, gangster rap in either this episode or the last episode, the advent of gangster rap happens right around the time that the crime rate starts to collapse. So if anything, like, correlation is not causation, but if anything, the evidence points towards gangster rap causing a decrease in violence. There was never, and the thing is, like, occasionally, first of all, like, usually, like, they will point to a single crime where the person seems to have been inspired or influenced by a media property, but the two things are, number one, first of all, there's no evidence that is common. Like, the reaction of most people into this stuff is not to go out and commit acts of violence. Second of all, there's kind of a chicken or the egg thing. You go, did this person who committed this crime, were they driven to the crime by the violent thing, or were they into the violent thing because they were the type of person who was going to commit a crime? Like, are they a satanic murderer, or are they a murderess who is a Satanist? Like, it's an important distinction to make. Like, I talked about that one kid who did claim to be influenced by Satanism, but he was already disturbed, and the actual stuff he found in Satanism did not support what he wanted to do, and he went and did the thing anyways.
I am confident that, I mean, world's a big place. Maybe there's some weird edge case out there somewhere, but I'm confident at minimum that in the overwhelming majority of these cases, that this is someone who is independently antisocial and violent, and they latched on to whatever was available, and, you know, no matter how much you censored or, you know, no matter how much you censored the media that they consumed, whatever the most violent thing was, that is what they would have latched onto.
And you look at like somebody like Albert Fish, extremely violent, sadistic serial killer. There's no media out there that he was being influenced by. But like, if you actually like look at the root causes of crime, like with what with a crime wave, we're not super sure like what caused it or what ended it. But it doesn't. If media is not a factor that gets considered, that is pointed to by criminologists at all. What gets pointed to is number one, that we finally stopped using lead in everything. That seems to have been a factor. Making abortion widely available, what seems to have been a factor, and also it does seem that we were probably under policing. Generally also agree that the crime bills that got introduced in the 90s way overcorrected and were targeting things that shouldn't have been targeted at all, but also, like, we've talked about, like, police incompetence. Like, we finally get to the point where the police are actually trying to solve crimes instead of just like, well, let's call the hot dog squad.
Yeah, I mean, you say under-policing. I don't think the problem was the level of equipment or the number of police. I think the problem is that the police clearly felt no incentive to actually do their jobs. Like,
yeah.
Which I find very strange, because, you know, these days, can you imagine how excited a detective would be if there were a serial killer in their town?
But, like, it's always been easy to point, like, it's, for whatever reason, like, people want to point to media, and usually the causes of this sort of thing is more complex and more multifaceted, and doesn't have, like you want to talk about media because it's glamorous. Like, I think that's just part of it. Like, talking about media is glamorous in the way that talking about, like, economics, like, the economic roots of crime is not. Like, you talk about, people don't want to talk about, like, how poverty factors into crime. They want to talk about, oh, the gangster rap. And it's not the gangster rap. It's not the fact that it's a socially underserved group that has no other means to survive. They want to talk about, like, oh, it's the violence in the movies. Like, and, like, a lot of the ideas about media doing bad stuff are just fake. They've been debunked. Even, like, what I once thought was an example of this was the Jaws movie coughing shark calls. Total myth. It did not actually cause any issues with the shark population. People didn't go out and kill that many sharks because of it. So, and that's, like, the only example I could have before have known that of media doing this. Like, the violence in media thing, it's a myth.
I mean,
ultimately, and, like, it's been
committing
violence,
violence...
that I really don't like engaging with it anymore. Like, you will not find a criminologist who takes this idea seriously.
Yeah, committing violence is scary as hell, and people do not do it because it looks cool. Like, they do it because they want something real bad. In theory, that something could be, you know, something ideological. You know, in the case of, like, violent crime, it could be just money. In the case of abuse, it is frequently just power. But, and, you know, in the case of abuse, it's also usually targeted against people who have minimal ability to retaliate, which makes it much less scary. And, of course, once you've already done something, it gets a lot less scary. But, you know, the takeaway from this is that no one commits acts of violence on a whim, or at least not their first act of violence. If someone is committing acts of violence regularly on a whim, it's because it was normalized to them at some point in their life. And, there is that famous saying that creative types like to repeat because it makes them feel like they are the secret Illuminati who controls the world from the shadows. That he who writes the ballads of a nation need not care who write the laws. Absolute fabrication. Repeatedly in American history throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, we have seen absolute left-wing domination of media with no resulting increase, noticeable increase in left-wing control of policy.
I think there's like a Kurt Vonnegut quote about how every single artist in the 70s was absolutely opposed to the Vietnam War, and it was about effective as a pie in the face.
Right.
Like, there's this weird thing where culture and literature frequently do not actually reflect each other. Like, there's this trope that pops up a lot in literature that I call nobody likes the popular kids, where the popular kids are these weirdly, everyone universally hates them, where obviously that's not true. They're the popular kids. They're definitionally well-liked. Like, Harry Potter is a good example of this, where Slytherin is the popular kids and everyone hates them, and they're like, they live in the basement. Like, that's not how popular kids exist in the world. Like, one of the few good examples of how popular kids function in media is Mean Girls, and like, I think partially it's because I almost called her Liz Lemon. Tina Fey partially based that off of the book Mean Bees and Queen Bees and Wannabes, which was an actual exploration of the lives of teenage girls, like a scholarly exploration of it. But like with Gretchen Wieners, people love her and are terrified of her. Like, that's what a popular kid is. Or think of like, when was the last time you've watched a TV show, and there are some examples of this, but when's the last time you watched a TV show where the popular jock was the hero? Like, it happens occasionally, but it's usually... It happens occasionally, like Riverdale or Friday Night Lights, but in general, the popular jock is the villain. But the reason that trope exists in major media at all is because for most of the culture, the popular jock is like really popular, and people like him, and he is like, there's a reason. Like, he's not hated, but our literature does not reflect this cultural fact. If you just looked at the literature, you think, well, everyone hates the quarterback, right? When you go and you vote on who the homecoming king is, you're voting for the least popular person in school, right? That's why that works. A lot of times the people creating literature were not the most popular people in their school, or they're frequently outcast, and that gets reflected in the literature, but it does not necessarily actually reflect the way the culture is.
All right.
Do we need to be quiet so you can beat the boss?
Potentially. It's mainly when they cluster on the side there, they get hidden behind the HUD, which makes it hard for me to notice their tells.
That's frustrating.
Because like when they're in the center there, you can see there's this little squirt of red right before they trigger their attack, and I can jump around it. When they're over here, over here is actually not so bad because the HUD is a lot less cluttered on the right side. The big old health bar on the left, though, occludes the topmost sister almost entirely.
The HUD is a cult, is what you're saying, then.
If you're very literal about your Latin roots, then yes. Now, with that said, once we are through this boss, we will have completed about a quarter of the game, possibly even a third, depending on exactly how you measure it.
Oh.
Yeah, it is actually going pretty quick. Which I can't imagine has much to do with my... I mean, I suppose I do adapt to the lesser mooks pretty quick because they have relatively simple movesets, and I have learned once in the past how to defeat all of them, so... But still, I imagine it's mostly got to be because I'm exploring faster. I roughly know the layout of the map and don't have to spend a whole lot of time figuring out which direction I should be going next. Plus, I have an actual map pulled up on the other tab, so...
Yeah, that probably helps.
Which, you know, I rarely reference that because then I have to tab out to find it. But anytime I'm like, oh, hey, which one of these doors should I go down in order to get through this as fast as possible so I don't bore the viewers? And you know, I just have that answer.
I like the idea of Metroidvania games, but I've never actually played one. And I don't know that I would actually like it if I played it.
Metroidvanias are definitely a lot more about setting than they are character or plot, so... Like, you know, the story of Blasphemous is implied, you know, it's in that Dark Souls tradition, which is not necessarily common to all of Metroidvanias or anything, but it definitely works well in Metroidvanias where, you know, there are clues as to what's going on scattered about, but they're never going to stop and just, you know, tell you straight to your face what's going on.
Kind of forgot to mention this when we were talking about it, but I now remember it. We were talking about the Da Vinci Code. Umberto Eco made fun of it a lot. He's like, people were asking about the Da Vinci Code because it was very similar to The Name of the Rose. He's like, look, I invented Robert Brown. Like, he's a character I created. If you know, there is, like, because the Robert Langdon, or not Robert Brown, Dan Brown is the guy who wrote the book. Robert Langdon is the character. Dan Brown is a symbologist, which is not a profession, but there is, like, you could be a semiotician. That's a thing. But apparently, at no point did Dan Brown come across this word. Like, semiotics is an actual field that Dan Brown was apparently completely unaware of. Which, and a lot of the Langdon's attempts at semiotics are incredibly stupid. Like...
Yeah.
I mean, this whole thing about the word, I remember about the word horny, claiming that it links back to, like, the horn gods of pre-Christian Europe, which the word horny didn't mean, like, sexually aroused or full of sexual desire in the 1800s, so, like, over a millennia after Europe had been Christianized. Up until then, it just meant having horns.
That was close. I was this close to falling off the screen.
Just like the attempts at semiotics in the Da Vinci Code are just terrible.
Yeah, I mean it's. I mean,
I think Dan Brown read Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and that was it. And Holy Blood, Holy Grail was stupid.
Like, pop semiotics is not a thing that I ever thought would exist, but it is ultimately not that surprising that it is
17 years old at this point. And so this is Zardoz, right?
No, this is Zordon.
So he's not going to tell us about how the gun is good and the penis is evil?
No, he is here to find 5 teenagers with attitude.
Oh, okay. How old is the penitent?
I mean, it's not actually clear.
Oh. So he could be a teenager with attitude.
For all we know. Yeah, we have now defeated 2 of the bosses and received 2 of the holy wounds that we need to enter the Mother of Mothers. Entering the Mother of Mothers, the Holy Basilica there, is the halfway point on the game, so roughly. Once we're in the Mother of Mothers, we then have to run around inside that. This is an enormous cathedral. So once we get in there, we have to run around there and whack another 3 bosses before we're allowed to go and kill God. I say kill God, we're actually killing the Pope. But it is fun to say that we're going to kill God.
Usually the killing God happens in the JRPG.
Right.
I think there's the one Dragon Quest game where like you do fight God and he's like this adorable little chibi. And also the strongest boss in the game.
I sure hope these cherubim are good guys.
Yep. I would call them. You can call them cherubim. I guess technically they're putties. But like, I haven't seen any 4-faced angels around, so they get to be cherubim.
Yeah, I think the 15th century era of art that this game is drawing on is unfortunately postdates the 4-faced angels phase of.
Yeah, the Renaissance art is what gave us the chubby baby cherubim, anyways. I don't know when they started getting called cherubim specifically, but that's what people think of when they think of cherubim, is the chubby-faced babies from Renaissance art.
I'll just drop off some bones in our reliquary, like you do.
The Renaissance is also when like artists figured out that, oh, actually babies are not just shrunk down men. And so you draw a baby, you draw a shrunk down adult man. Somebody in the Renaissance was like, guys, if you like, I went and I saw a baby today, and that's not what a baby actually looks like.
Now the other Renaissance artists were like, it's not. All the other artists were like, bullshit, where would you have seen a baby? Like, well, don't tell anyone, but like, I went into the nursery. Like, you did what? It was for the art, okay? I had to see what a baby looks like. You're like, I mean, okay, but I still don't feel good about this.
The questing beast from Arthurian legend is a very distorted description of a giraffe.
Oh, yeah? I guess that does make sense.
The unicorn is like a very, very telephone version of like this specific ox from like Tibet. Not ox, but a goat from Tibet. That eventually got turned into a one-horned horse with magical healing powers. So there's a species of goat in Tibet that caused My Little Pony.